Good afternoon. My name is Doug Holder, and I'm very happy to be having my guest, Anthony Sammarco, on my show today. Anthony Sammarco has a new book out, Lost Boston. Lost Boston. And it's a... Lost Boston is a nostalgic journey back in time to visit some of the disappeared buildings and places and all their grandeur before the wrecking ball and decline set in. And Anthony Sammarco is a historian who lectures widely on the history and development of Boston. He's the author of over 60 books and on his native city, including Boston, A Century of Progress in Downtown Boston. He lives in Boston and in Osterville on Cape Cod. So I was going to ask you, Anthony, you're saying Lost Boston. That really, when you say lost and you talk about nostalgia, it's more of a, is it a sad book in a way, or is it a sad, sweet, melancholy? I mean, how would you describe the book?
Well, I think it's a history book that actually does lament the loss of some of these buildings that actually were either destroyed for advancement or destroyed by fire or simply remodeled beyond recognition. But I think in a lot of ways Lost Boston is also something that makes us realize that, yes, we can't save everything, but some of the buildings that have been lost that are lamentable are things in some ways that we can revisit in this photographic book. And in many ways, Lost Boston is something that I hope is not sad to anyone, but it also is something that makes people realize that sometimes preservation is a good thing. And today we might look at some buildings and say that they have either architectural or historical value, and maybe we should save them. But again, as I say, not everything can be saved.
Okay. And that's just the way we were talking about gentrification, and, you know, we're maybe bemoaning it, but it's the way it's the name. Just as will be replaced by other generations, and will, as Walt Whitman said, come up as a blade of grass, right?
True.
You know?
It's that actually the city actually transforms itself, it seems like, almost every generation.
Yeah.
Boston, the surrounding neighborhoods of not only the city of Boston, but also the towns and cities surrounding Boston, are all very different than they were 25, even 50 years ago. And I think that they will continue to change. They've embraced change, and they also embrace different types of people that create that change. And I think sometimes when I think of historical landmarks, such as Jordan Marsh Department Store, or the Boston Garden, or even Braves Field, you begin to realize in some ways that these were once an integral part of the city and the people that lived there, and today they're remembered in this book.
Now tell me, you know, like I said, I came here in the early 70s to attend college, and it's, you know, when I get into Boston, I don't get into Boston all that much, but recently I was in Boston for the Boston Poetry Festival, and I was just looking around town, and it's changed since a great deal since the 70s. I don't recognize a lot, and you know, I was a member of the old Guild's drugstore where I used to have breakfast every morning, and I used to go to the Exeter Theater. And what do you think of the new look of the city? I mean, how does it make you feel? I know.
Well, Boston is a place that continues to embrace change. It will be something in a lot of ways that has a rich overlay of 17th and 18th century history, and that's thanks to both the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail, something that makes us realize our historical past is something that we need to preserve. But in a lot of ways, Boston over the last 25 or 30 years has become a much built-up city, and especially the downtown waterfront and the area of South Boston. We've seen such tremendous changes in a lot of ways that some of the things that have been lost have become in some ways places that are now almost unrecognizable. The other day when I was actually going to the Seaport District, I was looking for things that I remembered, small fish shops and just simple bars. And the area had changed to the point that they were all large hotels, restaurants, and they attracted huge numbers of people, but people that would never have gone there 25 years ago. And today, in a way, the neighborhood itself has become an integral part of the city. And the city expands. I mean, it's not just...
You know, there was this writer who wrote about New York, and I can't remember. It was a tremendous... well, anyway, go ahead. My memory fails me, but
But
it covers all
it's
this.
not
Colin
just the
Whitehead, he
north-
wrote
Colin
about it.
Whitehead,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But it's not just the north end or the south end or the west
Yeah.
end. It's parts of neighborhoods that
Yeah.
continue to change. And though there are some that seem to actually remain frozen in time, like Beacon Hill or the Back Bay, that's thanks to
Zoning laws,
architectural
yeah,
commissions. And these are things in a lot of ways that doesn't just protect the facades of the buildings and the coloration of a door, but also streets, sidewalks, as well as even the gas lanterns. And I think in a lot of ways, yes, we can preserve some, but it's a way in some aspects to realize that the city is, again, going to change. And maybe it's for the best. We look at it as an area now that creates tremendous economy. Tourism is a tremendous part of our business in the city. But it's also
But you know, but you want to preserve the history also.
Very
That's
much.
one of the main selling
Well,
points.
tourists aren't going to come if there isn't something historical to see.
Right.
And I think one of the things when I was in undergraduate school, they restored Quincy Market. And I was so happy to see this because when I was a very young child, my father's office was in the North Market of Quincy Market. And we would go there, and it was something that I remember to this day of sawdust-strewn floors and areas where there were delivery wagons.
Remember when Jacob Worth had the sawdust?
I do.
Yeah. Great place.
We
I
went
still
to
go there.
Jacob Worth's. When I was a child, I hated it, and today I love it.
Yeah.
But when I was a very young child, I remember remarking to my parents, "You mean we have to sit at a table with other people?"
Yeah.
And they were thinking, of course, this is the type of a thing. But when I realized, when I became an adult, that Jacob Worth was an institution in Boston, it was a place that
I mean,
was
you
great.
go in there, you smell Boston, you feel Boston. It's even today, it still has
Well, it's
that.
also the largest bar
Yeah.
in Boston,
Yeah.
and it's
And
also the
restaurant,
thing.
yeah.
Jacob Worth was someone who created a bar that actually served all sorts of beers and lagers.
And German
And
food.
it was Germanic food that was something that, when you realize Boston has huge numbers of Western Europeans, that included Germany, that their food and beer and lager was something that was to be enjoyed, but it wasn't unusual. A century later, it's something that's a wonderful place to
It's
go.
still there, but like a lot of the waiters and things are from different countries. So if I said to them, I came in one day with a friend and I said, well, give me a corned beef on pumpernickel. They said, what's that? I know. So it's still there, it's there, but they don't have the Irish bartenders. They're Filipinos or things like that,
Well, that's true, but
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm
when
just
I
saying.
go there, I always get the sauerbraten.
Oh.
It's the only place in Boston that I know we can get it.
Yeah.
But the Wiener Schnitzel is also wonderful, and it's something with a glass of some
House
sort of
dark or
beer.
something. Yeah.
I like Boddington. And
Ah.
I always think in a lot of ways it's one of the few places in Boston I can get it. Food, something of a alcoholic nature as a drink, is something that is part of this. Because when we look at the different things in Boston that we've lost, it's something in a lot of ways that was once part of everyday life. And in a lot of ways, we revisit it. Can't bring it back, but in our minds we can actually return with a photograph and an essay that actually extols its
Which your book so
importance.
astutely do.
Thank you.
Now, I have to ask you, because I don't know if you've ever covered this, but I was an employee and a patron of Ken's Deli in Copley Square. And I love that place, not only for the food, but, the characters were there, the sultry, the scowling waitresses, and then you had the drag queens, and you had the old ladies, with the 100 cats, and all these Boston characters. It was such a rich place, rich food and rich characters. Can you tell me a bit about how Ken's Deli and...
Well, I didn't know how it began, but I do remember it in the 1970s and
Yeah.
the early 1980s, going there late at night.
Right, late at night.
For something
Yeah.
such as my favorite, which was a turkey club, and sitting there and, of course, ogling everyone in the place.
Yeah, it was like characters.
I know.
Right?
I used to think, is anyone looking at me the way I'm looking at them?
Remember the big, heavy-set gentleman who was the manager, who was near the deli counter? He was sort of...
Yes, he was always there. He
Yeah.
was the one that actually I think was supposed to be the bouncer.
Yeah.
But you would stand in line, and if it was around Halloween, there were always Dorothy's from the Wizard
Yeah,
of Oz or
right.
whatever. But when you finally got a seat after, say, an hour's wait, it was something that was not just good food, copious, But it was also something that you began to realize nobody was drinking. It was only coffee or tea or something like a Diet Coke. You'd already had more than enough.
Right.
It was a wonderful place, and it was an institution, and again, it's food.
Is there anything like that now, do you think? I mean, I don't go out that much, but I mean...
Since I'm in bed at night,
yeah,
I
you
really
don't know.
think that there might be, there has to be. I think there's a diner, actually, in the area of South Station area.
Oh, Blue Diner or something.
Blue
But I
Diner
don't think that has I mean, this place was big.
It was.
It had two floors,
2 stories.
and then it had a little counter.
Exactly. Downstairs you could take away pastries and things of that sort, and ice cream.
Yeah.
But Ken's was a place during the day that there were business people having lunch or even a light supper. But in the evening it came to life. And it was something that was part of the Back Bay.
And it was everywhere. It wasn't
aspect.
just, Brahmins, and it was everyone. It was from every strata of society, it seemed to me.
Well, I think in a lot of ways you'd still see people coming after a dance or after a bar or whatever, but it was something in a lot of ways that was really part of the city, and that's something we've begun to lose.
Yeah, that's what I think.
The city in a lot of ways slowly evolves, but you begin to realize in some ways younger people have different interpretations of what is fun.
Right.
And it's not necessarily going out for a sandwich and a cup of coffee after an
that sounds kind of quaint, right?
It is quaint. It's like going to a Howard Johnson's where your grandparents actually had dinner.
But this wasn't a place late at night, this wasn't a place you'd go with your grandparents. I know, you believe me. It was, I don't think so, But anyway, that's interesting. Can you tell me a bit of history around the, and you covered this in Lost Boston, about the Boston Public Library, the old wing and the new wing. But how did that happen now, that transformation?
Well, at the time of the Civil War, the Boston Public Library was a very important institution because it was a public library. And above the door it said free to all. Boston had private libraries in the latter part of the 18th century and early 19th century, the Boston Library Society and the Boston Athenaeum. But the Boston Public Library came about in some ways with many people coming together to not only give money but their collection of books that would actually benefit the people of the city of Boston. And the first library itself was located on Boylston Street, which was opposite the Boston Common. The building was fantastic. Charles Kirby, a fairly well-known Boston architect, designed this as a brownstone Romanesque Revival building. And it would be there until it was actually moved to the Copley Square building, which was completed in 1895 by McKim, Mead and White. When you looked at the building, I mean, they probably would have been in this strategic location, but it had become commercial. And there was no way to actually expand the building. You could actually put it up, but the idea was it was already 3 stories in height. So the building actually was sold and demolished to make way for the Colonial Theater. So when people say that the Boston Public Library was on Boylston Street, there's a lot of confusion because it's still on Boylston Street, but this was something that was there for less than 50 years, but it was an integral part of the institutions of the city.
And there's nothing like going into the old Bates room and seeing that long line of tables. And I wrote a poem some years ago that was published in Stuff at Night about the old reading room and the eccentrics of the reading room. And I was going there, I was working on my master's thesis, and I started becoming one of these eccentrics myself, just coming mumbling to myself, writing every day, going to the... Because there was a whole cast, like the British Museum, this was a whole cast of characters. And also in that old wing, there was such a cast of eccentrics who would be there,
Well, there were 2 Bates Halls.
Yeah.
Really?
I didn't know
the
that.
original building was actually named after Joshua Bates.
Yeah.
He was a principal with Baring Brothers in London, and he had donated $50,000.
Now, where was the first one?
On Boylston Street, where the Colonial Theater is located now.
Okay.
And when he gave the money, they actually had a 3-story hall that was magnificent. The stacks overlooked the area. And, of course, when they built the present Boston Public Library, they also named the reading room Bates Hall. So Joshua Bates was someone who had already been known for over 50 years as a benefactor of the library. But one of the things I like about Bates Hall is the wonderful statuary, and it's things of the important people of Boston.
I remember they used to have in the hallway, it was such a, that now they have it in the courtyard, it was a, I forget, a woman holding up her baby. What was that statue again?
Bacchante and Faun.
Right, yeah.
And Bacchante and Faun is something
Yeah.
that is a beautiful bronze sculpture, but it was also somewhat aghast that people in Boston looked at it as somewhat immoral.
Yeah, I
and
know.
That's a
Right.
recast
Yeah.
because it was actually rejected by the Art Commission and given to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Later, a casting was made and placed in the courtyard after the restoration. But in a lot of ways, when you look at the museum, you might say to yourself, well, of course, there are paintings and statuary and things of that sort. But the Boston Public Library is as much a museum as it is a place to borrow books. And it's free and open to everyone.
Yeah, before it was the Athenaeum, which was very elitist, right?
Well, it was elitist in a way, and one had to have a share of stock to actually go into the library. But today, the Boston Athenaeum, though it is still a shareholding corporation, and I do have a share, it's something also that is available to the public to come in and see the first floor, visit the small art gallery, and then also see the reading room, and hopefully be encouraged to join. They're not expensive tickets, but it's also something that can be done as an annual ticket, a lifetime ticket, or if you wait long enough, a share of the Athenaeum stock.
Okay. Now, now I noticed that you appreciate oral history. You interview a lot of people, and there are all kinds of oral history projects going on. You know, you're sort of like, in a way, some sort of Studs Terkel. You know, you talk to a lot of people, especially with Howard Johnson. You're talking about the candy dippers and things like that. How do you get people to open up? And they're not always reliable historians. So how do you?
Well, in a lot of ways, when I write a book, and the history of Howard Johnson is a good example, you want a very well-rounded grouping of people. And you want people that were once in charge. So I interviewed the son of the former vice chairman of the board. But then I also did interview a candy dipper. I interviewed busboys, busgirls, waitresses, people that were once spending many, many years, whether it was high school or college years, while they paid their way through school. And many people did come up with stories that, of course, had to be substantiated, but it was an important feature to realize that we're all part of history. Each one of us plays a part, and whether we were the owner of the company or we were simply an employee, our stories are equally important because in Howard Johnson's case, it's something that if you're above the age of 50, everyone knows it. But no one under the age of 50 can remember Howard Johnson.
There are no Howard Johnsons left?
Nothing that would actually say the name of Howard Johnson, that it would be connected to Wyndham Corporation, which is the present incarnation of the company. There are still buildings that survive, and there are two restaurants, one in Bangor, Maine, and one in Lake Placid, New York. They do have the Howard Johnson name, they have orange roofs, and they serve much of the same.
Sort of like
food.
Bigford's. It's not a real Bigford's anymore.
Well, they're not real, and that's the problem. And in a lot of ways, people go and they're somewhat disenchanted and disillusioned, thinking that they're going to find shrimp curry or fried clams or things of that sort.
Or the grilled cheese.
Or the grilled cheese, yes. But I think in a lot of ways it's something that's part of people's memory, and whether they go and actually have one of the ice cream flavors, it's usually not 28 flavors anymore, but it's something in a lot of ways that they can actually go and enjoy. And
my late father was a PR man and was doing public relations for Howard Johnson's. And on Long Island, New York, where I grew up, he got me a job. I worked briefly as a soda jerk at Howard Johnson's on Long Island.
There were many people that were. When you think of Howard Johnson's being in business from 1925 to 1979 under the father and then his son, who was the second president, you begin to realize it was three generations of Americans that nobody
And according to
knew.
your interview, you said that he was the first franchise?
He's called the king of the franchise industry. And that was actually an outgrowth of the Great Depression. His line of credit was cut off. His restaurant and his ice cream stands for the 1920s and early 1930s were very successful. And one of the ideas he had was to provide all of the food and ice cream through commissaries. So if he sold a franchise at a set sum of money, and in the 1930s was $3,000, he would help you to build the restaurant, and then he would provide all of the food and ice cream. If you actually signed a contract, you couldn't serve anything other than the food from Howard Johnson. So it created a cash flow. And it was almost a pyramidal type scheme, starting with one, so that in 1935 the first restaurant franchise opened in Orleans on Cape Cod. By 1940 there were 125.
Wow.
So the restaurant franchisee, the man or woman who actually did purchase that contract, would eventually provide the money and the wherewithal for the expansion of the restaurant chain.
Now, I wanted to get to, we were discussing with one of our TV personalities here about the Dudley Street, the elevated tracks. I remember taking that. And it was sort of, of course, I had to write a poem about it because it was very poetic. I mean, going up on the cityscape, and then they tore it down, I think, probably, around 1980 or so?
In 1979 it was closed, and it came down between 1981 and 82.
Yeah, right. So I maybe took it for a year or two before it closed. Tell me, why did they take it down, and what's its history a bit?
Well, elevated railways actually started in this country in the period of the late 19th century. And the real reason was because there was no impeding of traffic. In the 19th century, Boston became so congested with many of its original streets, so that you would have pedestrians, carriages, wagons, and everything else, including streetcars, all vying for the same street. Backups were tremendous, and by elevating the railway above the street, the train could actually run on a timetable. By running on a timetable, it would start at 5:30 a.m. and stop at midnight, and it would run on a basis of going to every single station within 5 minutes. The elevated railway was something that provided the means of transportation for Boston's middle and working class to actually get from one side of the city to the other in a very short period of time. And whereas it might have taken at one time on a streetcar going from Dudley Street Station, which would be the first southern route, to Sullivan Station, almost 2 hours, the elevated railway allowed it in less than half an hour. And it was something that made people realize that if you lived within the district, you simply walked to the station, walked up the stairs, paid your nickel fare, and then, with a paper transfer, you could go anywhere through the city, which included what became known as the Red Line, which was not elevated, but it was something that actually did have elevated portions, but then also the trolley lines, which are the Green Line. So
And a lot of cities want to bring back trolleys, that's something about it.
Trolleys are green, and I think in a lot of ways when you think of an electrified trolley, Jamaica Plain was the perfect example. I mean, they had the overhead wires. Today we might see the overhead wires in Cambridge going towards Watertown. It's green. It does provide means of transportation, but not the carbon dioxide that one sees from the buses. And they're cleaner, they're more convenient. When we lived in Milton, there was a trolley that went from Ashmont Station to Mattapan Station, and this was something that was laid out in 1927. And many of these trolleys were the same trolleys, but it was a beautiful ride along the Neponset River. And when you finally got to Mattapan, there was a shopping district, and people actually had stops all along there. But it was something that was different than taking a bus. And today, it's also the aspect of looking at the trains and the transportation system and realizing that trolleys are an option.
Now, I was going to ask you, I think the best bus line in Boston is the Dudley Bus, because it starts out at Harvard, right?
I see, yes.
And it traverses the city, goes through all the social strain. You go from the Brahmins, and then down to all the way down into the heart of Roxbury, which is transforming too.
Exactly.
There's all these initiatives in Dudley Square. Would you agree? Or is there another bus line as dramatic as that?
Well, I think it is a dramatic area. You go from Cambridge, you go through the Back Bay. Many people take that bus to go to Symphony. They take it to go to the Back Bay shopping area. But then when you get to Dudley, you can take another bus that would actually take you even as far as Dedham. So I look at a lot of these lines, and they still provide means of transportation for people that live in a neighborhood. Demographics change, but in a lot of ways these buses have provided human duty for well over a century. The first electrified trolley was 1889, so we begin to realize how changed things are. That is a great example, but one of the ones that I like is the one that connects downtown Boston with City Point in South Boston.
That's pretty nice.
It goes along West
Doesn't it go to
Broadway.
UMass? It starts at UMass?
Well, they have one that
Yeah.
actually does do that, but this one goes along Broadway all the way out to City Point. And there's one other that connects that area that goes down to Andrews Square. So these are two lines that actually are something that we've seen change tremendously.
And finally, we have a new mayor, and he's working with the Boston Red. There's a lot of controversy about the BRA, I mean, how do you feel, and I know you don't like to talk politics, but how do you feel, does he have a vision? Because you know him, you told me. Does he have a vision? I mean, he's from Dorchester like you are.
He was.
Does he have a vision that you think is going to preserve the city also, as well as bring in, changes, a good mix?
Well, one of the things about Marty Walsh is that he listens to people. And I think one of the aspects about the city is whether or not one assumes there are going to be changes, there will be changes. And I think the city changes.
And that we were just discussing, like here in Union Square, there's going to be changes and people are going to be displaced in spite of all the talk about how there's going to be diversity and blah, blah, blah.
Well, demographics actually embrace change. And one has to look at any part of a city, whether it's Somerville or Boston, and realize that it's inevitable. But I think Martin Walsh will be someone in a lot of ways that he's begun to put people into positions that are not only responsible to him, but are people that are respected in the community. And I think his cabinet is a very good choice. Many of these people have actually shown themselves to be very capable community leaders. So I look forward to seeing what he does for the city. It's a very hard act to follow. I believe Mayor Menino did a fantastic job for 20 years. But I think Martin Walsh will be someone in a lot of ways that we will not only be respectful of, but also look forward to what he's actually offering city residents.
Do you miss living in Boston?
Well, we do keep a place in Boston.
Oh, okay.
And I lived in Milton for many years, but now I have a place in Brighton, and we are involved in the community, the public library. I'm president of the Friends group, but we keep a place on the Cape as well.
Well, so good to speak to you, Anthony, and we're winding down here. You have a reading coming up that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, on Tuesday of next week, for the citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library, I'm presenting a slide lecture on lost